Look, if you don't think World War II history is cool, it's probably because your teachers are focusing on the wrong things. From battleships made out of ice to phantom armies, here are the juiciest untold tidbits. How did we miss out on learning about the night witches? Called Nachthexen by German soldiers, mainly because it's German for night witches, these daring all-female Soviet pilots dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on the Nazis. Marina Roskova got permission to form a group of attack aviators as Germany scored massive hits against the Soviet Union. She decided to fill the squad with fellow female pilots. And while the old-school biplanes they flew were the result of a scanty budget allocated to the women flyers, not to mention widespread skepticism and harassment, the old aircraft actually gave them an advantage.
Made of canvas and plywood, their open cockpits would freeze the pilots' faces in the wind and rain.
The small planes rarely showed up on radar or other monitoring equipment, while the ability to cut engines just before attacking allowed them to quietly glide in and surprise the enemy. The old aircraft could also fly more slowly than their Nazi counterparts, which stalled out at lower speeds. Because the night witches were also denied radio equipment, along with parachutes, guns, or up-to-date navigation tools, there was no radio communication to intercept. Their skill led some Germans to suspect they'd been given medication that somehow allowed them to see in the dark. But the reality is that the night witches, many of whom wanted revenge for attacks against their families and homes, were highly skilled and motivated. They were just really good at their jobs and ticked off at the Germans. Roskova herself died in action in 1943, along with 30 other pilots lost in the campaign. All told, the night witches flew over 30,000 missions against the Nazis. The Polish army had a comfort bear, and what a great idea, actually. His name was Wojtek. He held the rank of private, and he was born in Iran when the Polish army came to know him. That's really for another video someday, but the story of the Polish soldiers in Iran is bonkers. You know the drill. Leave a comment and we'll try to make a video on that soon. Anyway, back to Wojtek. When the 22nd Artillery Supply Company of the 2nd Polish Corps were over there fighting those pesky Nazis, they saw the orphan brown bear cub and traded a local shepherd for him. His handler, Peter Prendis, taught the bear the basics of company life like saluting and marching, and his fellow soldiers gave him treats like dates, beer, and cigarettes, which he reportedly ate instead of smoking. Wojtek couldn't really be trusted with a lighter, after all, he was just a bear. He also enjoyed wrestling some of the soldiers, which actually doesn't sound any better than giving the bear a lighter, but if anyone died in the process, that didn't make the record books.
Marvelous. Really marvelous.
And lest you think Wojtek was just a furry freeloader, no way. He learned to carry shells during battle and eventually made it through. After the war, he went to live in Scotland, where he lived in the Edinburgh Zoo until his death in 1963. Your standard snooze-inducing lesson on World War II is jam-packed with arrow-covered maps of troop movements and fists full of dates. And for some reason, they leave out the cool, unforgettable stories like the one about the Ghost Army. Now, before you get too excited, no actual spirits or specters were involved. But the Ghost Army did create the phantom impression of masses of Allied troops and military equipment ready to strike. It was all a traveling war circus produced by about 1,100 artists and military personnel that totally fooled the Nazis. If the Germans had looked more closely, they would have seen that most of that equipment was fake. It included inflatable tanks, actual tank-shaped balloons, plus made-up radio transmissions and speakers blasting warlike sound effects.
It was a little bundle of stuff, all compressed before you opened the bundle, spread the nozzles around, and inflated it.
Consider Operation Fearsome in March 1945. While a detachment of real Allied soldiers was preparing to cross the Rhine, a ghost army 10 miles away set up hundreds of dummies and fake equipment to convince the enemy that the divisions were elsewhere. Radio transmissions, bridge construction sounds blasted over speakers, and loud discussions of fake plans in local bars, cafes, and streets completed the picture.
Like I tell my children, was the biggest boombox you ever saw, but it played sounds of tanks and activity.
The Nazis bought it all. They attacked the fake army while the real ones safely crossed the river. So while it may sound frivolous and even kind of fun, the Ghost Army saved the lives of an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 members of the US military, while simultaneously making the Nazis look like total idiots. World War II is full of stories about wild weapons, many of which were real, from space-based efforts to tiny bombs strapped to bats. Yet few were as gross and, in a weird way, as effective as the rat bomb. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like.
They take the bodies of recently departed rats, They fill them with explosives and then stitch their little bodies back together.
British forces would leave these beside German coal supplies with the idea that someone would see a dead rat and hastily shovel it into a boiler with the coal to get rid of the nasty thing. The charge would explode and ruin the boiler, striking a blow against the Nazi war effort.
Off goes the shipment of rigged rats. Everything seems to be going to plan. That is, until the Germans smell a rat.
Yep, the Germans figured out the rat ruse right away, but while the Allies quickly gave up on the idea, German soldiers spent considerable time digging through their coal looking for rat bombs. So even though Britain put very little effort into the incendiary rodents, it remained an oddly effective time waster, giving them, shall we say, fine, I'll say it, more bang for their buck. Do you even realize the stroke of US military genius that was the use of code talkers? In case you're not familiar with who they were, that would be service members fluent in indigenous languages set up and used codes that Japanese listeners couldn't break. The history of the code talkers actually goes back to World War I, when the Choctaw Telephone Squad began operating in Europe. By World War II, the US military was specifically recruiting people fluent in both a tribal language and English. Their job was to translate coded messages from English into their language, then communicate that message, often via radio, to another tribal language speaker. These messages included key information about their own troops and the movements of the enemy. Many of these code talkers were Dene or Navajo people. Their work was credited with helping the Marines win the Battle of Iwo Jima, among many others. Other code talkers hailed from a diverse array of tribes, including the Comanche, Hopi, Mohawk, Chippewa, and Crow. Britain has an outpost on Gibraltar, the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula between Spain and the Mediterranean Sea. But during the war, it was vulnerable. With Axis forces lurking in North Africa and to the east on the island of Sicily, a German or Italian takeover was a very real possibility. British forces wisely had a contingency plan, but it was grim. Known as Operation Tracer, a small group of men were meant to be left behind in an underground bunker that had been excavated in great secrecy. At first, the plan was for 5 soldiers to stay for a year in what became known as the Stay Behind Cave Complex. Eventually, this was expanded to a maximum of 6 people for up to 7 years.
Of the 6 people chosen, there were 2 radio operators, a doctor, an officer, and a signalman.
They were to be trained in surveillance techniques, but also on how to maintain their quarters, eat properly, and stay psychologically healthy while living in a cave with a bunch of other dudes surrounded by the enemy. And if anyone died, they were to be buried in the floor of the cave. Though construction was completed by 1942 and a team was put together, the invasion of Sicily in August 1943 helped turn Axis attention away from Gibraltar. The stay-behind cave was soon sealed up, and though rumors persisted of a secret World War II cave in the area, no one was sure they'd uncovered the stay-behind cave until the late 1990s. It may sound like something invented by Dr. Evil, but the notion of a giant weaponized space mirror launched by Nazis was, for at least a brief time, a real possibility. As you well know, the Nazis were getting their Sieg Heils kicked, and they were desperate for something to take out targets. One of these ideas was the Sun Gun, a massive parabolic mirror launched into space that would focus the sun's rays onto specific targets, presumably setting them on fire or melting them into oblivion. The idea was literally never going to take off. Rockets weren't yet powerful enough to build space weapons. The right sort of mirror was hard to make, and who was going to maintain it? Astronauts were 20 years in the future, so unless the Nazis also invented a time machine, the whole thing was so theoretical that one can't help wondering if the scientists assigned to the idea were secretly rooting for the Allies. But for some reason, the Sun Gun idea persisted, both as part of the quasi-legendary, sometimes off-the-wall Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapons, developed by Germany, and as a more altruistic scientific idea. A similar concept was even floated as a way to concentrate heat onto the surface of Mars and create small pockets of Earth-like conditions in a far-future situation. If standing in front of a classroom droning on about supply lines is putting your students to sleep, it's time to talk about Project Habakkuk. The project began in 1942 when scientist Jeffrey Pike was tasked with solving the problem of moving ships through the North Atlantic. Nazi U-boats terrorized the region, and military planes had a hard time getting out far enough to run defense. What's more, shipbuilding materials like steel were getting scarce. So how are ships to make it through the infested waters safely? Pike's solution? Get a whole bunch of ice. It sounds crazy, and it kind of was, but it was also real. Pike designed a ship with an ice hull, although later iterations used an ice-wood pulp mix called Pikecrete in Pike's honor. It would have been the biggest warship to date, at about 2,000 feet long and over 2 million tons. Britain went so far as to source ice from Alberta, Canada, building a 60-foot prototype there in 1943. But though it floated, crafting a seaworthy vessel was tricky.
Oh! Hey, you almost broke the ice! I'll break your head.
That's when Iceland came into play, becoming a key base in the North Atlantic, and radar advancements made it easier to strike back at U-boats. So by summer 1943, testing was called off, and the Project Habakkuk prototype was allowed to sink into Jasper National Park's Patricia Lake. In case you really slept through class, let's hope that you know that German and American soldiers were enemies during World War II. But there was one little known moment when they teamed up against an even greater enemy. How nobody's turned this into a movie yet is a mystery. It all happened at Castle Itter, a medieval Austrian fortress that had been repurposed as a prison for high-ranking detainees, including French government officials, military officers, and a famous tennis player you've never heard of. Trust me, Jean Barocha was pretty famous. They named a sportsmanship trophy after him. Anyway, though they had far more comfortable conditions than those detained at concentration camps, the prisoners of Castle Itter were nonetheless prisoners. And by 1945, as Germany started to fail, the possibility that they would all be killed by retreating Nazis became very real. Enter Major Josef Gangl, a decorated Wehrmacht officer who'd soured on the Nazi regime and decided to defend the Itter prisoners. He teamed up with U.S. tank commander Captain Jack C. Lee Jr., and both sides sent small groups of soldiers and one Sherman tank to the castle. The Waffen-SS, who were hot on their heels, destroyed the U.S. tank but couldn't breach the castle itself. Lee and Gangl's combined groups managed to successfully defend Castle Itter, saving the lives of the prisoners inside, losing only one man, Gangl himself, who was struck by a sniper's bullet. Germans and Americans teaming up to take on the Nazi SS? Crazy, right?